Welcome to another one of your Flip lectures. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss the early 1960s, John F. Kennedy, the Cold War, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. After serving the maximum 2 turns, Dwight Eisenhower's presidency was set to end in 1960. So, there was a presidential election that would turn out to be one of the closest elections in modern history. The Republicans ran the sitting Vice President Richard Milhouse Nixon. You may remember him from McCarthyism, but he also served 8 years as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. His challenger on the Democrat side was a senator from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy had one serious problem going into this election. He was a Roman Catholic. And at this time in American history, many Americans did not trust Catholics and thought that if John Kennedy was elected to be president, that he would take his orders directly from the Pope. In order to basically get rid of these rumors, John F. Kennedy gave a very famous speech where he basically addressed the fact that he was Catholic and how his religion would not have a big impact on how he would carry out the office of president. This moment was seen as a big one for the acceptance of Catholics by others in mainstream American society. Now, something that was very new during the 1960 presidential campaign was the fact that television would be used more so than in any other election before it. And in fact, the first televised TV debates took place in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. A lot of historians will actually credit these television debates with helping John F. Kennedy win the election over Richard Nixon. They thought that basically he looked much better on television, he was more photogenic, he was younger, and basically those who watched the debates on television all thought that John Kennedy had won, whereas those who listened on radio thought that Richard Nixon had won. So you're starting to see at this point in history the importance that television is going to play in greater American history. The election itself was one of the closest in all of American history. John F. Kennedy barely beat Richard Nixon, especially in the electoral vote. This was the closest election at the time since 1916. So, basically you can tell that the country was very divided and this election was very open. But in the end, John F. Kennedy won a narrow election by winning a lot of the major cities, including Chicago and Illinois. Kennedy was elected to the presidency, he brought with him a wave of optimism. The president and his family would become not only the first family, but also have a huge impact on the culture of the United States. Their White House was known as Camelot, which was named after a popular musical of the day about King Arthur and his knights. And most of this optimism was based on the president and his family. John F. Kennedy was a young man in terms of other presidents and other candidates. So when he came in, he symbolized a new youthful United States and a new beginning. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, who is seen in this photo here, would also bring in a suave new sense of design to the White House and basically would change the social norms around the presidency forever. Here is one of the iconic images of this Camelot era where you have John F. Kennedy working and his son peeking out through basically a door in the presidential desk. Here's another photo of President Kennedy playing with his young children. So all of this energy at the White House translated into an era of good feelings, at least at the beginning of the Kennedy administration. But very soon into his presidency, John F. Kennedy would have to deal with a couple of large issues dealing with the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And these were the building of the Berlin Wall, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In a previous Flip lecture, we learned about how Germany and the city of Berlin were basically split up between the Allied powers at the end of World War II. In 1961, this would become a big issue that would build a literal and symbolic wall between the Soviet Union and the United States. On August 15th of 1961, Soviet soldiers started putting up barbed wire along the divide that separated the east side of Berlin from the west side of Berlin. Now remember, the east side of the city of Berlin was going to be ruled by the Soviet Union and have a communist government, whereas the west side of the city would basically be run by a democratic capitalist society that was basically supported by the United States. So this barbed wire fence went up to essentially divide these two parts of the city. In the preceding weeks and months, an actual physical wall was built where the barbed wire fence had been. It was a tall wall made of stone and basically meant to keep people in East Germany as well as keep people from West Germany from coming into East Germany. Here's another photo of the wall. As you can see, it was patrolled by armed guards, and here's a picture of a large amount of people standing at the wall looking over. So why did the Soviet Union decide to build this wall in 1961? And, as you can see from this picture, the primary reason that they built the wall is to prevent people from leaving East Germany to go into West Germany. In this very famous photo, a soldier who is basically a East German soldier fighting for the Soviet Union jumps over the barbed wire fence while he can and defects over into West Germany, which is going to be controlled by the United States and Europe. So the wall was meant to basically keep people out, but also to keep people in East Germany and under Soviet control. So the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviet Union, and it was primarily built to keep people from leaving East Germany to defect to West Germany, which was in the United States' sphere of influence. But the Berlin Wall becomes one of the biggest symbols of the Cold War division and that idea of the Iron Curtain that separated the Soviet Union and the United States spheres of the world. And this wall would actually remain up from 1961 until 1990-1991, when the wall would start to come down. The building of the Berlin Wall was seen as a large crisis in the Cold War, and it was basically seen as a symbol that the relations between the United States and Soviet Union had gotten even worse. The relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union would be tested again from October 14th to 28th of 1962 in basically some of the most harrowing and dangerous 13 to 14 days that the United States has ever experienced. So before we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm going to talk for a minute about Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is going to be the leader of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And how he gets into power is that he leads a communist revolution in Cuba. He lands in the country with basically a force of 50-some men and eventually fights and wins a guerrilla campaign against the Cuban government. So Fidel Castro and his communist revolutionaries take over Cuba and declare it a communist state. For the United States, having a communist country right in its own backyard was not something that it wanted. And so John F. Kennedy authorized the CIA to try to take back Cuba by arming a group of Cuban exiles to try to reinvade the country and take over. This invasion would be known as the Bay of Pigs for where they landed, and it would be considered a disaster. All of the invasion force was defeated, and Fidel Castro trusted the United States less and was reaffirmed that the United States would continue to try to remove him from power in Cuba. Here's a photo of Fidel Castro with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. This photo illustrates the idea that the Soviet Union and the new communist Cuban state were going to work very closely together. And an opportunity for them to work together against the United States would come up very, very shortly. Here's a picture of U.S. missiles in Turkey and Italy. If you look on the map, you can see that Turkey and Italy are very close to the Soviet Union. From these missile sites, the United States could fire nuclear weapons into the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union felt very insecure knowing that the United States could attack them and they didn't have any missiles in range to attack the United States. And this is the point in the story where Cuba comes in, where the Soviet Union negotiated with Fidel Castro and the communist Cuban government in order to set up missile sites where Soviet missiles would be put into Cuba so that they could be aimed at the United States. The Soviet missile sites were spotted by United States spy planes in October of 1962, and this intelligence basically started what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here's a picture of a map that basically shows you how far these missiles that were in Cuba could reach in the United States. As you can see, Soviet missiles in Cuba would be able to destroy all of the major cities in the United States and Mexico. So in response to the revelation that there were missile silos in Cuba run by the Soviet Union, the United States decided to blockade the country of Cuba and not allow any ships to get through this blockade that could possibly be carrying nuclear warheads. And so the United States Navy was deployed to surround Cuba, and a crisis escalated. And this crisis would basically involve a battle of wills between the United States and Soviet Union over these missiles that were in Cuba. Shortly after the blockade was put up by the United States, Soviet ships, possibly carrying nuclear weapons, challenged the blockade of Cuba. Basically, they set sail for Cuba, and they would try to challenge the blockade that the United States had put up. So, over the course of a few days, those ships neared closer to the blockade, and tensions started to rise. During this time, a spy plane was also shot down over Cuba, which led the United States to be A, a little bit embarrassed, and B, for the Soviet Union to distrust the United States even less. And all throughout this time, there were threats of nuclear war on both the United States and the Soviet Union side. While the Cold War was heating up in public and people began to become very afraid, the leaders of both countries, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, began back-channel negotiations. This meant that they were negotiating not in the open, but in secret, so that basically neither would be under extreme political pressure not to back down. And ultimately, after days of negotiation, they reached an agreement after these secret negotiations. And the agreement was as follows. The Soviet Union would remove all of their missiles in Cuba, and they would do this publicly to basically alleviate all the tensions in both countries. And in return, the United States removed all their missiles in Turkey and Italy, but they did these in secret so that basically the entire public didn't know. The United States public, as well as the Soviet Union, may not have even known about all the missiles that were in Turkey and Italy. And the United States also promised not to invade Cuba as a result of this crisis. So, in the public eye, it became a humiliating defeat for the Soviet Union because the things that the United States had conceded, those parts of the agreement were in secret. So basically to the world, it looked as if the Soviets had backed down, when in reality it had been a compromise. But the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, would basically lose his place as leader 2 years later. A lot of historians credit Khrushchev with being willing to negotiate, even though it cost him his position as leader. And so, probably the hottest point of the Cold War is going to end in a peaceful settlement rather than the nuclear war that seemed almost inevitable for those 14 days. During this period of time, the United States is also going to begin inching its way into the conflict in Vietnam that would eventually make up the Vietnam War. And in the 1940s and 50s, there was a civil war in Vietnam. Vietnam used to be occupied by the French army. It was a colony of France. But that French army had been defeated by rebels known as the Viet Minh. And after the defeat of the French army, the country descended into civil war, with the northern part of the country being communist and the southern part of the country being a republic. Though I put republic in quotations because the leaders of the republic were actually not as free and open-minded as the United States would like to have had them be. But in 1961, the United States sent money and 1,000 military advisors to train the army in South Vietnam to hopefully win the civil war in Vietnam. Those advisors and that money would be the first time the United States got involved in Vietnam, but it would certainly not be the last. The country would change forever on November 22nd of 1963. As the young president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, rode through the streets of Dallas on a routine visit, a sniper's bullets caught the young president in the head and ended his life. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, it was considered the end of an era in the United States. All the optimism of Camelot was gone, and now the United States felt like it had lost its innocence when it had lost its young, energetic, and hopeful president. If you ask older Americans where they were when they heard John Kennedy was shot, I bet they can still tell you. It was that traumatic of an event in the United States at the time. The assassin Lee Harvey Oswald would be arrested, but he would be killed by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, before he was able to stand trial. A full investigation would be launched into Kennedy's assassination, and the Supreme Court of the United States would find that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin who had killed John F. Kennedy on his own. Shortly after the president was killed, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president on Air Force One. He would then have to lead the United States through the rest of Kennedy's term. There was a national funeral for the young president, and it was considered a national tragedy. People turned out in large numbers to watch the casket go by, and millions more watched on television as the young president's body was finally laid to rest. Some iconic images from this time include John F. Kennedy's family standing in mourning. You can see his wife Jacqueline in the veil, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, and his young son who is saluting the casket as it rolls by. So after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson had to take the office of the presidency and guide the United States through the rest of Kennedy's term and beyond. And Johnson as president is going to continue a lot of John F. Kennedy's policies. He's going to do a lot on civil rights, he's going to continue the space program, and other such initiatives started by John F. Kennedy. Lyndon Baines Johnson would run for re-election again in 1964 and win in a huge landslide. Part of Johnson's plan was called the Great Society, and this involved the war on poverty, which involved a bunch of new government programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, expansion of Social Security, and other such programs meant to combat poverty and inequality in the United States. All this led to a big expansion of government spending and government power that is still controversial to this day. And ultimately, President Johnson is going to be the president who escalates the Vietnam War, which is going to cost the United States as well. 60s were a period of great optimism, but also a period of great conflict and great danger. Now, President Johnson and the rest of American society would have to decide how they would deal with the very complicated problems of civil rights, the Cold War, and poverty inside the United States. Even though the early part of the 60s were over, the conflict that this decade would bring to the United States was only beginning.